Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 2021 University of Hertfordshire Chancellor's Lecture. My name is Robert Salisbury. I have the great privilege to be Chancellor of this university, an institution which has been developing and growing over many years now, and which makes an enormous contribution to our local life in our county. Being Chancellor, of course, you will not be thanked for interfering in matters which are none of your business. But I do have one privilege, which is to nominate an annual Chancellor's Lecturer. This has not been an easy thing to arrange because of the wretched virus. But I'm delighted to say that thanks to the miracles of modern technology, we do have not only a lecture this year, but also a very distinguished lecturer. In the past, we've had a tremendous mixture of speakers from the worlds of education, politics, science, the law. We've even had a distinguished field marshal. But as far as I know, as far as I can remember, this is the first Chancellor's Lecture which has been delivered by an art historian. And it is indeed, I think, the first one that has been delivered online. So we're very fortunate in having Professor Karen Hearn to deliver this lecture. It's part of a series of events which go outside the university itself. My wife will think perhaps that I'm being rather self-indulgent in this, but it is an event which is part of a series commemorating the 500th anniversary of the birth of the great Lord Burghley. He was not entirely clear himself whether he was born in 1520 or 1521. We assumed originally, pre-virus, that it would be 1520. But since in the same document he referred to himself as being born in both years, we must credit him with even greater foresight over 5 centuries than perhaps we'd realized. But we do think, and perhaps I'm biased, that this remarkable man is worth commemorating. After all, the events of the 16th century, I think you could argue, prepared the way through the Elizabethan settlement for what this country became over the succeeding centuries. Without it, it would have been a very different place. And without him, I think it's fair to say Queen Elizabeth and the Elizabethan settlement would not have been possible. He was her chief minister from her accession in 1558 until his death in 1598. And he really took an interest in every aspect of national life. The archetypal new man of the 16th century, a bureaucrat, a scholar with an eye for detail, which would have been the envy of even a modern day cabinet secretary. So we think that he is a man well worth commemorating, and I hope that you will agree. Now, it's my very, very pleasant duty to introduce Professor Hearn to an audience which encompasses more than one continent and many countries. We're delighted that so many of you have come to listen to her. Most of you will know of her great distinction. She was the curator of 16th and 17th century British art at Tate Britain in London from 1992 to 2012. She's now an honorary professor at University College London. And of course, she publishes, broadcasts, and teaches on art made in Britain broadly between 1500 and 1710. And I think she'd be fair to say, Karen, you have a particular specialization on British Netherlandish cultural links during that time. I won't give you the full list of the many exhibitions which she has curated, particularly at the Tate, but the one that I mostly made the greatest impression on me among many was, I thought, an extraordinary exhibition called Dynasties Painting in Tudor and Jacobean England, 1530 to 1630, for which she understandably received a European Woman of Achievement Award. And of course, she also curated an exhibition at the Foundling Museum in London last year, which is very much to the point in view of her chosen subject for us this evening, portraying pregnancy from Holbein to social media. And we were fortunate enough to be able to look at the book that she produced to complement the exhibition, called Portraying Pregnancy from Holbein to the Social Media. So we're talking about the same thing. So Professor Hearn, thank you so much for coming and for making the effort. I know that you're in tremendous demand, and we're very flattered that you've been able to accept our invitation. So we look forward greatly to what you have to say. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that very generous introduction. A painted portrait of whatever date results from a series of choices. These are arrived at through the interaction between the artist, the person or people who commissioned the picture, and, if they're not the commissioner, the sitter, her or himself. Among those choices are what elements should be included and what excluded. In other words, historical painted portraits are just as curated as Instagram images today. In the case of this portrait, the individuals were Mildred Cecil, the sitter, her husband, Sir William Cecil, and the busy Flemish migrant painter from Antwerp, who had settled in London about 20 years earlier, Jan Ewouts, known to us today as Hans Ewert. Almost everything that we'll see on the screen today is from Hatfield House in Hertfordshire, not far from the university. And I'm so grateful to Lord Salisbury for enabling me to show them. Hatfield House itself, of course, was never owned by William and Mildred. It was acquired by their son Robert some years after their deaths. This lecture is not going to address William's distinguished public career, but will consider a brief period in the couple's family lives in the early 1560s. Pregnancy, resulting in the production of healthy, legitimate children, has always been central to the role of noble and royal women. It maintains family and dynastic continuity, and although both conception and successful birth could sometimes be extremely problematic and were acknowledged as such, prior to the 20th century, many women did spend much of their adult lives repeatedly pregnant. But choosing to depict a pregnancy in a portrait was very unusual. So when and why was that choice made, occasionally made? For many years, as you've probably gathered, I've been researching and identifying painted portraits of Tudor and Stuart period women that were made at a time when they were with child, and in fact, whether that pregnancy is made visible in the portrait or not. In 1558, Elizabeth I came to the English throne, and it's from very early in her reign that these portraits of elite women that visibly depict pregnancy begin to appear. And they do seem to have been more common here in England than in other Western European countries. I've identified at least 40 so far, dating from 1562 until about 1635, and more examples keep appearing. They are, of course, effectively multiple portraits because the bump has a father and will itself have an identity. So these images are effectively representing a family. And by the way, pregnancy was not the word that was in use at this time. It comes in much later in the 18th century. A woman was said to be breeding, teeming, bearing, great or big with child, and most commonly and delightfully, big-bellied. My study has primarily focused on portraits of British women, and as you've heard, most recently, this work resulted in an exhibition at the Foundling Museum in London last year, and a book of the same title. Born in 1520 or possibly 1521, as you've heard, to gentry parents in Lincolnshire with connections at the Tudor court, William Cecil spent 6 years at St John's College, Cambridge. In 1541, he married Mary Cheek, whose brother John was a leading Greek scholar there. She gave birth to their son Thomas the following year, but died less than 2 years later. William's subsequent second marriage in 1545 to Mildred Cooke, who was from a more socially elevated and well-connected family, must have assisted his advancement. Under Henry VIII's son, Edward VI, his role was as junior secretary, and he was knighted in 1551. When the Catholic Mary Tudor came to the throne in 1553, William chose to retire from office, but his well-established links with her half-sister, Princess Elizabeth, over the next few years, meant that immediately on succeeding to the throne in November 1558, as you've heard, she appointed him her Secretary of State, and he remained her chief minister for the rest of his life. Throughout his career, William was determined to raise the Cecil family from country gentry to nobility. To this end, he amassed considerable wealth, which enabled him to build or rebuild spectacular properties, in the design of which he played a key role. His 3 principal properties were Burghley in Lincolnshire, which he inherited and transformed, and which he bequeathed to his first son, Thomas. Burghley House, as it was called in his ownership, which he built on the Strand in London, and the great prodigy house that he created over a 20-year period at Tybbalds, spelt Theobalds, near Cheshunt in Hertfordshire, which was to have such an impact on his contemporaries and which Elizabeth I visited 8 times. Virtually nothing is left of Tybbalds now. Today, for clarity, I'm using the names William and Mildred in perhaps rather a familiar manner, but over their lives, through William's endeavours, their titles were to change a number of times, so it's just easier to stick with William and Mildred. When he was knighted in 1551, he became Sir William Cecil, and in 1571, he became first Baron Burghley, Lord Burghley. Born in 1526, Mildred was the eldest of the 5 daughters and 4 sons of the discreetly Protestant Sir Anthony Cooke of Gidea Hall in Essex. And Cooke, like William's first brother-in-law, John Cheek, had been involved in educating Henry VIII's son, Edward VI. And Cooke gave all his own children a thorough humanist training in modern and classical languages, including Latin, Hebrew, and Greek. Mildred was thus one of the best educated women of her time. And in fact, in 1550, Roger Ascham, tutor to the future Elizabeth I, commented that Mildred and Lady Jane Grey were the most learned women in England. Fluent in Latin and Greek, Mildred herself made a number of substantial translations. Around 30 of the books that she owned have been identified. More than half of them are still at Hatfield House. Here's a selection, and their title pages show that many of them had been printed abroad, and many include her various ownership inscriptions. So at the foot of most of the pages, and in the central one, we can see that she has carefully inscribed Mildred in Greek, or a Greek text. After William was ennobled, the inscriptions reflected, of course, her subsequent name, Lord Burghley, Lady Burghley, as we see here, Mildred Burghley, Mildred Burghley. Mildred also gave books and made other donations to educational institutions, including St John's College, Cambridge. She otherwise left comparatively few manuscripts of her own. Her sisters also married politically useful and in some cases successful men. So Anne Cooke married William's friend Nicholas Bacon, who became Lord Keeper to Elizabeth I. It's been noted that more portraits of William Cecil himself survive than of any other English individual of the period, except for Elizabeth I herself. And some of them are copies of copies, but there are a large number. Just 2 painted portraits of Mildred are extant. It's extremely rare to find evidence of the precise circumstances in which a 16th century portrait was commissioned, and thus of the thought processes and decisions that informed its eventual content and appearance. When considering a portrait of a married woman, for instance, we can't reconstruct the discussions that took place between the sitter and her husband, as well as with the artist, and how and by whom decisions were made. But William and Mildred seem likely to have acted jointly over the form that Mildred's painted portraits took. We don't know where or how the portraits of Mildred were displayed during William's lifetime, but they're not private images. They would have been intended to be seen and admired in the various Cecil family residences by carefully chosen visitors. There are no verbal accounts of Mildred's physical appearance. One later piece of evidence lies in the notes made in Latin by Dr. Theodore de Mayerne, who was the physician to Mildred's son, Robert, and indeed to most of the elite of Jacobean London. At a consultation in July 1611, less than a year before Robert's death, he seems to have told de Mayerne that his mother had had aliquantulum gibber, which has been translated as a little bump or a slight scoliosis. So Robert, who had very visible scoliosis, in the past called a humpback, seems to have inherited that condition from her, as did his own daughter, Frances. In line with the practice of the 16th century, the choice was clearly made not to show this in Mildred's portraits. But as I've indicated, painted portraits were routinely edited to include or exclude unwanted elements. For instance, we virtually never see smallpox scars, which so many people must have carried, rendered in painted portraits. They're just edited out automatically. The early 17th century inventories in the Hatfield archives indicate that Robert inherited 3 portraits of Mildred. In 1611, one of them was hanging in his bedchamber at Hatfield House. One picture of your lordship's mother. So he kept it in a special personal space. Another portrait was at the splendid residence, by then called Salisbury House, on the Strand in London. And the third was at another Cecil property in Herts, Quixwood House. It's been speculated that during William's lifetime, he might have displayed one portrait of Mildred in each of their 3 principal properties, Burghley and Tybalt's, as well as the house on the Strand. The 2 surviving portraits of Mildred have come down through the Cecil family and are today, as we've heard, at Hatfield House. The third one seems to have been lost, apparently before 1833. In 1629, the portrait that was at Salisbury House in London was described as having a taffeta curtain which could be drawn across it. This was quite common at the period. The curtain would protect the surface of the painting from dust and smoke, but could also be used to control who would be allowed to see the portrait. Since both of the extant portraits, like many others in the Hatfield collection, were, as you can see, reframed uniformly, framed in a similar patterned frame at the end of the 18th century for the 7th Earl, 1st Marquess of Salisbury. That frame with the curtain no longer survives. Painted on wooden panel, as was customary for English portraits at this period, neither of these 2 portraits bears a date or any other inscription. So we have to seek other evidence to determine when they were painted. The fashion of the rich clothing, quite different clothing in each portrait, that Mildred wears is one indicator, as well as attempting to assess roughly how old her face appears in the portraits. That's always quite a difficult task and not necessarily reliable. In both portraits, Mildred is shown in similarly styled gowns and headdresses, so they were probably made not far apart in time. One on the left perhaps came first, as Mildred's face may look a little younger in it. And in the right-hand one, as we've said, Mildred is depicted as visibly pregnant, probably with Robert Cecil, who we know was born on the 1st of June, 1563, which would date this portrait to the first half of 1563. So we have two portraits from early in the 1560s. It's been suggested that Mildred loved fine clothes and jewellery, as seen in abundance in these two portraits, and that may well have been the case. But rich clothing and much jewellery principally signalled family wealth and particularly status. Sumptuary laws at this time meant that specific textiles could be worn only by individuals at particular levels of society, although in England these laws tended to apply primarily to men. Anne of Cleves had been Henry VIII's discarded fourth wife, who lived out the rest of her life in England. After her death in July 1557, at the age of about 41, William and Mildred attended the sale of Anne's effects at Chelsea Old Manor the following month. So this was still in the reign of Mary Tudor. And at the sale, they bought a number of garments in fabrics that were reserved for the elite. 3 rich kirtles ornamented with pearls, embroidery, and cloth of silver, along with 4 gowns, 1 of cloth of gold, 1 of cloth of silver, 1 of purple velvet, and another of black wrought velvet furred. So these are all extremely elite and expensive and luxurious textiles. In the portrait on the left, it's possible that Mildred's sleeves and skirt are of cloth of silver. I'm certainly not saying that that's Anne of Cleves' cloth of silver. Another significant element in both the portraits of Mildred is heraldry, a common feature in painted portraits of this period, here and here. And the arms have been slightly differently marshalled in each. In the left-hand portrait, Mildred's complete married arms are shown, set within a Mannerist cartouche, a fashionable feature possibly taken from a design in an imported French or Italian print. It was much commented upon that William's buildings were liberally decorated with family heraldry, as was the case with many other noblemen's buildings. And for many of the educated and the elite, heraldry could be read as if it was a likeness, or as if we read brand images today. The left-hand image appears to have been devised as a single self-contained portrait, because in husband and wife paired portraits, it was the convention internationally for the male sitter to be on the left and facing our right. And for an example of this, here are the companion portraits of the mercer, Sir Thomas Gresham, Elizabeth I's agent in Antwerp, and his wife, Anne Fernley. And they were painted in Antwerp by the Dutch artist Antonis Moore in 1563-4, and thus at around the same time as Mildred sat to youth. John Guy's illuminating recent biography of Gresham describes him as, quote, the first true wizard of global finance, but has also revealed his personal ruthlessness. And Antwerp was one of the leading trading centres of Europe, and also a centre of artistic practice. And so you can see here really the level of skill, the level of quality that was available to Gresham in Antwerp, and perhaps not to the same extent for the Cecils in London. The second portrait of Mildred, however, the pregnancy one, may perhaps have originally been paired with a companion portrait of William, although that now appears to have been lost. And that's suggested by the fact that only half of the couple's arms appear, as if there might have been originally have been another portrait of William with arms on as well, and they would have effectively dovetailed together. And also Mildred is in that right-hand position, facing to our left, almost invariably employed for the wife in these paired portraits. I'm very grateful to jewellery historian Hazel Forsyth for providing me with what was effectively an audit of the jewels that Mildred and William clearly selected to display in each of her portraits. And we know that by 1570, Mildred's jewellery was regarded as a family financial resource. So in the earlier portrait, the jewellery seems to be a carefully chosen ensemble with common design elements tonally matched. Every piece has been precisely placed and considered with the repetition of rose designs. So we see that in the upper pendant here, mirroring the roses in her blackwork embroidery, and in the puffed fabric of her sleeves, and in the larger pendant below. This jewel is not attached to its chain and must in fact have been fastened, perhaps stitched rather than pinned, directly to her stomacher. It's fashionably mannerist in its design and pattern, and again, it has this rose structure. The scent bottle hanging here is also mannerist in style, and Hazel Forsyth commented that the linking unit, which forms part of the lower end of the chain, is particularly interesting. She says it's a clever bit of design since it evidently had a swivel component that allowed the bottle to pivot and to hang properly. So in other words, the unknown artist had been instructed to make very precise and accurate representations of Mildred's jewellery. And we see this overall rose symbolism which includes fresh rose here tucked into her bodice. She's also, as we'll see in a moment, holding fresh rose in her hand. And this combination of fresh and artificial blooms, so we have that rose jewel and we have the fresh rose here, is extremely common in 16th century English portraits and in portrait miniatures. So here we see that scent bottle in more detail, and we see the fresh rose and its leaves. The painter of the pregnancy portrait of Mildred is thought to be, as I said, a Netherlandish migrant who was possibly trained at Hoorn, which is in the northern Netherlands, but was a member of the Painters Guild in Antwerp in 1540, Jan Ewelts, now known as Hans Eweth. He'd settled in London during the 1540s and, based in Southwark, became and effectively during the 1550s and 1560s, the leading court painter here. Around 48 paintings, mainly portraits, are attributed to him and the busy workshop that assisted him. He was the chosen portraitist of Mary Tudor, and he painted Elizabeth I in the early 1560s. A number of his kinsmen were goldsmiths and jewellers, and it's been suggested that he may himself have received the same training because he was so very skillful at rendering the details of jewellery and luxurious fabrics. So for both the portraits, the Cecils had selected the kind of presentation that they wanted. So in this pregnancy portrait, Mildred's gown, including the inside of her collar, which must have been rather uncomfortable, is decorated with ornamental convex mounts in the form of pierced rosettes. So it's this rose format once again, enamelled in black, white and turquoise, and these would have been stitched into place. Hanging below her gold enamelled and pearl set girdle chain, and only partly visible, is the upper part of an enamelled gold urn-shaped scent bottle. So here, another scent bottle. Mildred's family arms, as we can see in both her portraits, included from her forebears in the Machin family, a black double-headed eagle with a fleur-de-lis here. And in this portrait, Mildred wears a pendant jewel in the form of a double-headed eagle. Its chain has been looped to form two swags, the lower one supporting the pendant, although again, given its likely weight, it must also have been pinned to her bodice. The eagle is made up of circular, baguette, lozenge and triangular shaped faceted diamonds, so very distinguished gems. And the largest stone, which is triangular, forms the body of the bird. Below it is a stylized fleur-de-lis, also made up from diamonds, from which is suspended a large pear-shaped pearl. So we've got both the black double-headed eagle and we've got the fleur-de-lis. So this is unambiguously a heraldic jewel, and it's resting over Mildred's bump. So, as I've said, pregnancy was central to the role of a 16th century woman. Sons were most desired, but daughters too could be placed in advantageous marriages and extend the family network. Behind this portrait of Mildred lay a checkered obstetric history. For the first 9 years of her marriage with William, there had been no children. In July 1554, Mildred gave birth to a daughter, Francisca, who died shortly after birth. And then in December 1556 to a daughter, Anne, who lived to adulthood. After Anne's birth, Mildred's father wrote to William to say that he was pleased she had come through the delivery, and also that, while a son would have been a greater blessing, it boded well that Mildred had given birth twice in such a short period, and at her age. Mildred's next two pregnancies produced 2 boys in succession, both of whom were named William, because the first one died a few hours after his birth in October 1559. The second William lived for 19 months, but died in December 1562. And that must have been a devastating loss for the couple. We'll return to the pregnancy portrait again later, but we're going to look now at another roughly contemporary image that includes representations of Mildred and William, though not primarily likenesses. It's a sketch design for a family funerary monument for the couple and their children. It was never built because it was superseded by events. It's dated twice, here and here, 1562. And its likely time of making can be narrowed down further to between late December 1562, when the second William died, and the 25th of March, that's Lady Day, in 1563. In 16th century England, the year was considered to run from Lady Day to Lady Day, rather than the calendar year, starting on the 1st of January that we use today. William's biographer, Stephen Alford, has proposed that this sketch, with its Latin inscriptions, may have been made on the instructions of William and Mildred by Lawrence Noel, the polymath mathematician and cartographer who lived in the Cecil household and who did draw maps for William, which survive and which include comparable figures. This form of monument, with figures kneeling at a lectern, was very much considered, it was a Protestant one. They kneel They have the word of God in front of them. So William here kneels in armour with a helmet resting before him. And this signifies his status of knight. He was a knight at this time. Facing him is a richly dressed, kneeling Mildred. And we're seeing very much similar dress form to the painted portraits. Below, on the left, kneels William's son from his first marriage, Thomas, aged about 20 at this time. And on the right, William and Mildred's then only living child, Anne, born in 1556 and thus 6 years old, but represented here as an adult. And heraldry, once again, plays a significant role in the design. This notional dynastic monument did not include William's first wife, Jane Cheek, who had died 20 years earlier and had been buried at the expense of her own family in the churchyard of Great St. Mary's in Cambridge. As mentioned, we can date this sketch to during or soon after December 1562, because as well as the living Thomas and Anne, the sketch also mentions the couple's 3 deceased children. So Francisca here on the female side, under a skull, signifying that she's dead, and the 2 little Williams here under William. It's been suggested that when this sketch was commissioned, it was with, quote, an assumption that there might be no more pregnancies. But in fact, the opposite must have been the case. Mildred was to give birth to Robert on the 1st of June, 1563, as we've heard, at the age of around 37. As that was her 5th known pregnancy, including any miscarriages that we don't know about, she must have been well aware that she was once again expecting. So when this was drafted, the couple would have been hoping to have another son together, but no doubt cautious about expressing hope. So this was a time of Cecil family dynastic insecurity, but it was also one of national dynastic insecurity. In 1563, the succession was a huge political preoccupation. Elizabeth I, seen here in a later portrait from 1585, who had succeeded to the English throne only 5 years earlier, was now 29, 30. That sounds quite young to us, but not to her contemporaries. And she was, of course, unmarried. In early 1562, a highly political play, Gorboduc, was performed before her at Whitehall by the gentlemen of the Inner Temple, written by 2 ambitious future courtiers and set in an imaginary ancient Britain. The play described the catastrophes that could occur when a monarch died without an obvious heir. And the play ended with national confusion. Later the same year, in October 1562, the Queen contracted smallpox. William had to draw up emergency plans in case she died, and these plans were for a council that would govern the country until an heir had been established. In fact, Elizabeth recovered, but the fragility of the monarchy had been exposed. The Parliament that sat from January to April 1563 debated the succession, petitioning Elizabeth to marry, but also to name, in the meantime, an interim successor, until she had given birth to an heir herself, which they assumed she would do. As Stephen Alford has observed, the royal succession, the defence of the realm, and the protection of Protestant religion were never far from Cecil's mind or pen. So the painted portraits of the Cecils were dynastic enterprises similar to the proposed family monument. And indeed, they were also potential memorials, albeit in the more fragile medium of oil paint on wooden panel, rather than memorials in stone. The sketch and the portraits can be linked to the perceived Cecil dynastic stress of the early 1560s. But then Mildred gave birth to Robert, and indeed to a further daughter, Elizabeth, in 1564. Dynastic anxiety must have abated after these 2 successful births, and indeed probably time ran out for Mildred for further pregnancies. William purchased the initial land for Tybalt's in 1563, and Tybalt's became the property that he built for Robert to inherit. So going back to the pregnancy portrait, let's consider it in context. It was included in the Foundling Museum exhibition last year, although owing to its fragility, it appeared as a reproduction. It's one of the earliest examples of those English portraits that showed the female sitter as visibly pregnant, and indeed which signalled this in an almost exaggerated fashion. So these are painted portraits in which the choice had been made to depict the pregnant bodily outline. We don't know whether there had been earlier examples, but what seems to be the first surviving one is this portrait of Catherine Carey Lady Knowles, a cousin of Elizabeth I. Catherine was 38 when she was depicted as visibly pregnant by an unidentified painter in 1562, the date inscribed here, it's not very clear, on her portrait. In April 1540, aged 16, Catherine had married the 28-year-old Sir Francis Knowles. Thereafter, she was regularly with child, giving birth to at least 8 sons and 6 daughters. After Elizabeth's accession in 1558, she appointed Catherine one of her 4 ladies of the bedchamber, the women closest to her. And indeed, Catherine may have been in an earlier household of Elizabeth's from 1556 onwards. Politically close to William and equally staunchly Protestant, Sir Francis had been a fellow member of the Privy Council since 1558. On the 9th of May, 1562, so that's the year inscribed on the portrait, Catherine gave birth to a daughter named Dudley, which sounds very strange to our ears. And sadly, Dudley was to die just a month later. So she must be the bump here in Catherine's portrait. On the green fabric-covered surface before her stands a small dog which gazes out at the viewer, a symbol of marital fidelity. Like Mildred, Catherine wears some serious jewellery. So we have a very heavy, very elaborate pendant here, and we have another jewel at the end of her girdle chain here, which is thought to be, it's a military-looking classical figure, possibly the god Mars. When Catherine died on the 15th of January 1569, while attending the Queen at Hampton Court, Elizabeth reportedly fell into, quote, passions of grief for the death of her kinswoman and good servant, and ordered that the huge sum of £640, that's more than £100,000 in present-day money, should be spent on Catherine's funeral, which took place in Westminster Abbey and was conducted on almost a royal scale. It's not actually clear why the decision was taken to depict Catherine with what would be her final pregnancy made visible. But chronologically, Mildred's is the next known English painted pregnancy portrait. Her loose gown is completely unfastened to reveal a black bodice and a black brocade skirt over her immense rounded stomach, and the bulge is given visual emphasis by waved lines of gold embroidery. Mildred holds a bunch of cherries, symbolizing the state of innocence, and thus appropriate to a virtuous wife. Many of the extant pregnancy portraits are of now unidentified sitters, but when we do know who they are, they tend to be women from Protestant families. And Protestant texts repeatedly emphasize St. Paul's words, woman will be saved through childbearing, provided she continue in faith, love, holiness, and virtue. So these writers rejected the Catholic belief that virginity was a spiritually superior state, and they promoted marriage and childbearing. A Lutheran pamphlet published in Germany in 1553 stated that the state of fertile and bearing, that's pregnant, women is a holy and divine state. So in Elizabethan Protestant England, a visibly pregnant woman was blessed. Prior to the mid-19th century and the medical advent of hand washing, childbirth could be extremely hazardous. There were so many things that could go wrong, and even if a woman came safely through the birth, she might be carried off afterwards by an infection such as puerperal fever. The surviving records are not complete enough to be precise, but according to some estimates, around 1 in 100 women died in childbirth or shortly afterwards. And this meant that childbirth was seen as a time of high danger for a woman. So a pregnancy portrait might itself also end up functioning as a memorial. Towards the end of the 16th century, we see a fashion for published mother's legacy texts. They're written by women who feared that they might die in childbed and were intended to be given to or to direct the education of the child if it should live, although the mother did not. And perhaps these paintings might also have been intended to play a similar role. Mildred survived all her pregnancies and her lyings in. She died on the 4th of April, 1589, aged 63, at the house in the Strand in London, a few months after the death of the couple's daughter Anne, the Countess of Oxford. William lived on until 1598 and erected a lavish and enormous monument to Mildred and Anne in the chapel of St. Nicholas on the south side of Westminster Abbey. It's the second highest monument in the Abbey, about 7.32 metres, 24 feet high. And as you see, it's very different from the 1562 sketched proposal. It's a much more complex narrative of figures, of Latin text, and of heraldry. It includes 7 sculpted figures representing members of the Cecil family. So we have William here, we have the deceased Anne, deceased Mildred, Robert here, and Anne's 3 daughters who had come to live with the Cecils, having been, poor Anne was rejected by her husband. The texts on it, written by William, add up to the longest known epitaph on a female monument in Britain. Describing Mildred as dearest above all, it lists her virtues and her many charitable donations and gifts to the poor, which had often been carried out in secrecy. Mildred Cecil's pregnancy portrait is one of many manifestations of the enterprise to firmly root and raise the status and extend the power of the Cecil family. Yet it's also much more. It arises out of the period of Cecil family dynastic activity at the start of the 1560s, a period at which concern about the national succession was also intense. Intended through the display of luxurious fabrics and significant heraldic jewellery to impress contemporaries, it needed also to have been able, if necessary, to act as a memorial to a woman who, in carrying out God's work of motherhood, might lose her own life. Thank you.
Karen, thank you very much for that. Absolutely fantastic and most interesting. Now, my name's Quinton McKellar and I'm the Vice-Chancellor at the University, and it's my great pleasure to convene the question session. Karen has agreed to answer questions. We'll restrict it to about 15 minutes if you don't mind. But if you have questions for Karen, could you please now put them in your Q&A section of the Zoom meeting, and I'll receive them at this end. But if you'll allow me to kick off, Karen, can I ask you a little bit about the portraits, because you've shown 2 fascinating portraits of Mildred, but were there other portraits, and were they equally splendid as the ones that you've shown?
Well, we know that, as I mentioned, there was a 3rd portrait, which seems to have been lost before the beginning of the 19th century. It seems likely that there will have been others. We have the impression that there's an enormous attrition rate of historical portraits from this period, and that the number that survive are just a minute fraction of the ones that were originally painted. particularly portraits painted on wood, are so vulnerable to all sorts of, to woodworm, to damp, to atmospheric humidity. So the ones that we do have are very important, rare survivals.
Karen, the first question we have, and I'm sorry, I don't know who has asked the question, but the question is, could you explain the significance of the cherries in the hand in the pregnancy portrait, and why was this a symbol of fertility?
Oh, no, it was a symbol of innocence, actually, and chastity in a wife. You very often see cherries held in portraits of children, particularly Netherlandish ones. So the children or the cherries are being held by the stem, so that the bloom on the fruit itself is untouched. And this is, that is the symbolic of innocence. Yeah,
and a very interesting question, our second one, which is, it relates to the funeral monuments and whether the sculptures there ever depict pregnant women, or is it only in paintings that you saw pregnant women in those days?
Well, that's a very good question. And in fact, in my book, I slightly address this. There was a very important article published, I don't know, about 25 years ago by Judith Hertig. And she looked at the question of women aren't really depicted as pregnant, but funerary monuments of this period really start to mention if a woman died in childbirth. And sometimes the woman is shown holding a baby, and that's when the baby dies as well as the woman. But that is it's a very interesting subject, funerary monuments to women who die in childbirth.
Now, Jennifer has asked, well, she firstly says, thank you for a wonderful talk, but she's asked, are girdles particular to early pregnancy portraits, or do they fall out of fashion?
Well, girdles, they're worn they're highly fashionable, but if you've got a bump, the girdle hangs quite differently. It's effectively going to the artist is going to use the line of the girdle to draw attention to the shape of the bump and emphasize it. But they are highly fashionable and highly luxurious items worn by all women at the period.
Yeah. A question from Derek. You say that Mildred Cooke, Lady Cecil, who was one of the most learned women of her time, and why do you say that now? I think he says he missed the first 15 minutes of the talk. Oh. Can I supplement the question by saying, or asking, you did say that she translated a number of books. Do we know what the subject matter of the books which she translated what was?
We do, and at this particular moment, I can't actually recall. But she was translating from Latin and from Greek, and she was also involved in the enterprise to retranslate the Bible into English. She was a really powerful figure in terms of her intellect and the way that it was respected and effectively consulted.
Yeah. Patricia is asking if we know how the artists were selected.
We know so little about the commissioning of paintings, the reception of paintings at this period. It's quite rare to know who even painted a picture. We have so little information on English and in fact Scottish too, British portraiture at this period. So any small sort of morsel that comes up is very valued. So the answer is we don't effectively.
Yeah. A fascinating question from Robert. Were there any restraints on the display of magnificence and prosperity by good Protestants? And effectively, he's asking if he could elaborate on the conventions and their limits.
Well, the sumptuary laws are limits. They're really, they're medieval and they operate really all over Europe. There are local sumptuary laws which will ensure that only certain people, at the top of the tree will wear certain fabrics, and sort of the natural order of things is transgressed if somebody wears very inappropriate textiles. In England, it seems they're not applied as, in some places, quite draconianly, but in England, it's more relaxed. And as I understand it, in England, they're mainly for male, or for men wearing luxury fabrics. And of course, being a Protestant, this is really, we're not talking about Puritanism. You wore whatever you wanted, at this stage.
Yeah. Now, Tim has asked if Mildred, Lady Jane Grey and Margaret Roper were the best educated women of their generation, were they also great intellects, and do any of their writings survive? I assume he means here original writings. Were there any original articles which they produced?
I think there are a few pieces by Lady Jane Grey, and as I say, translations by Mildred. Margaret Roper is, I guess she is really a generation, she is that bit earlier. And I think quite a lot has been written about Thomas More's family, and rather in the same way that Anthony Cook was doing a bit later, more educated both his sons and his daughters to a high degree.
Yeah. Now, Karen, I'm conscious that you've been, well, not on your feet, but certainly on Zoom for more than an hour now. I'm going to just ask two more questions and then we'll draw this to a conclusion. So I'm really sorry, there are many more questions being asked. I'll then ask Lord Salisbury to come back in. But the next is a really interesting one. It's from Chris, and he asks, do you see similar pregnancy portraits of Catholic women, either in England or abroad, during this period?
Well, my research has focused on British portraits, but I have also of course, I can't resist if I see something from any. So we do see some Catholic examples, and I think we're seeing them really at the top of the tree. We're seeing royal women, Habsburg women, for instance, being so Spanish and Austrian throne Habsburg women being sometimes depicted as pregnant. As I said, in England, very often we don't know who the sitters are, so we don't have the information as to what their faith was.
Yeah. And the last question, Janet, firstly indicates it as a brilliant talk, so thank you very much for that. But she says, given the existence of these pregnancy portraits, are there also contemporaneous portraits showing infants with their mothers?
I would say there are very, very few, in fact. I think we see a few slightly later on, and then when we go into the 17th century. But in the 1590s, there are a couple of group portraits which are painted by an artist who specialized in this kind of portrait called Marcus Gerrits the Younger, who painted Elizabeth I in the Ditchley portrait. And there are these two family group portraits by him. In each case, we have the woman, she's pregnant, and she has her older children around her. Her husband is not in the portrait. So he is, in fact, perhaps the person who's commissioned it and is effectively looking at the portrait. Yes, but that's the 1590s.
Great. Now, Karen, I'm going to ask Lord Salisbury to rescue you from the questions. I have to say, though, that there are many more questions and people have found this obviously incredibly interesting, but let me hand back to Robert Salisbury.
Well, I think my first job, thank you, Quintin, is to say a really heartfelt thank you to Professor Hearn. I think those of us who've been lucky enough to have heard her lecture before knew we were in for a bit of a treat this evening. And it's a treat, inevitably, knowing who she is, which has been informed by her deep scholarship and her remarkable perception. And I do think that, speaking for myself, I knew we had great expectations, but they really have been exceeded this evening. Thank you so much for a remarkable lecture. And I think the number of questions has made it very clear that you aroused even more interest than perhaps was around from the very broad range of people who sat and listened to you. I think the second thing I must do is thank the University of Hertfordshire for yet again acting as host for an annual Chancellor's lecture. I'm really grateful, as always, to our Vice-Chancellor, Quintin McKellar, no mean lecturer himself. One of the treats of our year is the annual Vice-Chancellor's lecture. And I must also mention Amber Gardner and her team, who have shown why our university is justly known for its technical and AV skills, which have made, as far as I know, this evening's exercise go, in a technical sense, extraordinarily smoothly. And of course, those skills have never been more needed. We know what a tough time this has been for students, and our university is no exception. So modern technology has really made at least something possible to salvage something from the wreck which otherwise threatened by COVID. Now, I hope you'll also allow me to make a small final puff for the Lord Burghley 500 Foundation, which was established to commemorate the 500th anniversary of the great man's birth, and which hopes to leave a legacy in the wake of the commemorations, which many of which have been delayed because of the virus, but which will come to a climax next year in a great service at Westminster Abbey in June. I hope that many of you will visit our website, and that you will, I hope perhaps some of you, particularly local schools, will eventually be able to benefit from our legacy when we come to decide what form that is eventually going to take. So really all I think it remains for me to do is to thank Professor Hearn yet again, to thank all of you for attending, for your questions, and perhaps as a final puff to say, for those of you who don't know the University of Hertfordshire and are attending one of our events for the first time, I hope that this will not be your last brush with us, and that you will be regular attenders at future events, not all of which are of such extraordinary quality as what we've just heard, but pretty nearly all of them are. So thank you so much for coming, and I wish you bon voyage if you're on your road, and a very good night anyway.